Bandwidth for changelog is provided by Fastly. Learn more at fastly.com. We move fast and fix things here at changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com. And we're hosted on Linode servers. Head to linode.com/changelog.
This episode is sponsored by our friends at Rollbar. How important is it for you to catch errors before your users do? What if you could resolve those errors in minutes and then deploy with confidence? That's exactly what Rollbar enables for software teams. One of the most frustrating things we all deal with is errors. Most teams either A, rely on their users to report errors, or B, use log files and lists of errors to debug problems. That's such a waste of time. Instantly know what's broken and why with Rollbar. Reduce time wasted debugging and automatically capture errors alongside rich diagnostic data to help you defeat impactful errors. You can integrate Rollbar into your existing workflow. It integrates with your source code repository and deployment system to give you deep insights into exactly what changes caused each error. Give Rollbar a try today at no cost to you. No credit card is required. Our listeners get access to the Bootstrap plan with 100,000 events for free for 90 days. To get started, head to rollbar.com/changelog.
Welcome to JS Party, a weekly celebration of JavaScript and the web. Tune in live on Thursdays at 1 p.m. US Eastern at changelog.com/live. Join the community and Slack with us in real time during the shows. Head to changelog.com/community. Follow us on Twitter. We're at JSPartyFM. And now on to the show.
All right, welcome everyone. You are listening to another episode of JS Party. This is episode number 29 in our weekly celebration of everything JavaScript. I'm KBall, I'm your host for this episode, and I'm joined by two of our awesome JS Party panelists. First off, we have Nick Nisi. How's it going, Nick?
Hey, I'm doing good.
Sweet. And Jared Santo. What's up, Jared?
Not too much, KBall. I'll tell you what, you're doing such a great job bringing the joy, bringing the MC skills that I might have to rename myself JBall just to steal some of your cool.
That's pretty good. All right, so next time I actually try to write a JS Party rap, I'll call you JBall and we'll see what we can do.
Please do. It rhymes with more stuff than Jared, I think.
Like KBall.
It rhymes with KBall quite nicely, yes.
Fancy that. All right, so today we are talking about this big fancy schmancy survey report, user survey report that the Node.js Foundation shipped last week. Now they published this foundation. They talked to several thousand or something like 1,800 folks who are using Node, gathered a whole bunch of data, sliced it, diced it, got it analyzed by a third party, put together an interactive version of it. And there's just lots of stuff there about what's going on in the JavaScript community. So let's first kind of start off by talking a little bit about why do we think this is important? You know, y'all were pretty excited about doing this episode. So Jared, maybe tell us what got you excited about this report? Why is it important?
I'm a data nerd, I guess. I like tracking progress of things and seeing where our community and different, subsections of our community have been and what they're doing now and where they're going. And so anytime somebody puts together reports like these, I just like to dive into them. And I don't usually have too much output coming out of that. I would love to do more things with the data, but I at least like to read it and think about it. I think also the Stack Overflow survey is another one that we focus on. And I think GitHub even was doing some GitHub user surveys, which we had a show on that back in the day on requests for commits. So I just like the data side. I don't know. How about you guys?
Yeah, I really like using it as an indicator to see where things are and how ahead or behind my skill set is compared relative to other developers who took this survey. But it was also interesting to compare it to the previous year. So I looked at 2016 through 2018, and just interesting to see how things have changed.
Okay, well, you did a whole write-up on this on InfoQ, right? So you obviously think this is pretty important as well. Are you coming from a similar angle as we are, as why we care?
Yeah, I mean, I proudly rock my New Relic Data Nerd shirt from 2009, and we'll dive into anything. One of the things I really appreciate about this is they not only sort of show the high level and let you slice it, dice it interactively, but for the true geeks among us, they give us the data so we can actually go and analyze it. But I kind of was looking at this from a couple of perspectives. One that has been bouncing around my head for a while. There was a blog post a couple weeks ago by Anil Dash that was titled "What if JavaScript wins?" And it was sort of playing with this idea, JavaScript as the JavaScript ecosystem as a network that might be getting escape velocity and sort of dominating all other languages. And so this coming out right after it made me think, well, can we find any evidence, pro or against? Like, is this actually happening? In some ways, I mean, there's definitely strong evidence that JavaScript as a ecosystem is growing extremely rapidly. But I found this this report kind of counteracted that sense as well, because it seemed to show continued focus in the web dev space. And if you look back a couple years, it doesn't seem like JavaScript is growing in all domains. It seems like it's still pretty focused on web developers.
So what did Neil say would happen if JavaScript wins? I personally, I don't really want to see a winner declared. I don't think there will be. One of the reasons I'm excited about WASM is, bringing more people to the table. I'm a polyglot, so I like having lots of different facets, lots of different languages. I don't really want a winner. I don't want a homogenous, JavaScript blob that powers the entire world. What about you guys?
The post, I think, was kind of playing with this idea of where do developers and companies choose to invest first? And, he highlighted that, there's always going to be room in development for niche solutions and things that are targeting particular use cases. But that, when your people are building developer tools, or they're building libraries and frameworks, or building interfaces to libraries and frameworks, they have to make prioritization decisions. Which languages are they going to target or support first? And
right.
Kind of where he was saying is, it is possible that we'll end up in a situation where JavaScript has such incredible mind share and so many people doing it that it becomes the first choice for all of those. And many of those products will go on and support other languages, but some won't. And so it would kind of create this kind of entangling network where the default choice, if you didn't have a strong reason to do otherwise, would be JavaScript.
Which we're definitely, I mean, I know why he wrote that post. We're definitely seeing the tide, shifting or rising or whatever it's doing in that direction. And it's interesting, especially when we get to the section on learning Node.js and how people go about learning. It's interesting to see, for specifically Apple with open sourcing Swift and trying to get that in such a learning aspect of the world, like education, and with people who are coming into programming, that be their first language. Because what we're seeing is JavaScript is a lot of people's first language now. And you can tell how important that is for continued use by how much Apple is throwing into trying to get Swift to be that first language.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think resources and learning is a big one, and that was actually one place where it was once again looking at this year-over-year data. Some things didn't change at all. Like looking for this idea that JavaScript is taking over the world, I didn't see any evidence for that. The percentage of people doing web dev versus IoT versus whatever had stayed pretty similar. But what did change was year over year was satisfaction with the learning resources, and also what percentage of people responding were new to programming. So I think JavaScript has made, and particularly Node has made some big strides in improving the learning resources out there.
Well, let's come back to learning. Let's start with the rapid growth that you've documented. I think this was one of the things that you highlighted in your InfoQ article. And this quote of 10 million Node.js users, according to the survey, as compared to over 7 million Node.js instances in 2017. So there we have a large rise, right?
Yeah. Well, how many developers do we think there are out there? I mean, I've seen a number of different numbers thrown out, but I think the higher end was something like 20 to 30 million developers. Does that mesh with what you guys have heard?
I'm frantically trying to grab a recent number. I don't think I've heard recently a number, so I'll have to go on yours. I'm looking at a RedMonk article about how many developers are there in the world. GitHub said, this is back in 2017, 21 million developers working on 59 million projects. That's a slide I'm seeing off of a kind of a GitHub State of the Union, which I think was worldwide, not GitHub wide, but that jives a little bit with what you just said.
So even if we take the very high end and say there's 30 million developers out there, that means 1 in 3 are using Node. That's crazy.
That's incredibly high. Now, what does using mean? So a lot of this stuff is up to interpretation, both on our side, like how we interpret the results, but then also on the individual survey taker's side. And I'm sure they're given more context than we are. But when you say node user, do we know exactly what that means? Like,
Great question. No idea.
no idea. Okay. It's subjective. If you think you're a node user, you are one. Something like that, maybe.
Yeah, I wonder if they...
And if you think you are, you're probably taking this survey.
Yeah, that's another good question. And, all these surveys have their biases built in, reminding me of our conversation about machine learning and the biases built in there. But this is surveys of like node users.
Mm-hmm.
According to the overview, it was fielded in English and Chinese from October 27th to January 2018, yielding over 1,600 respondents. They don't really go into the details of how they went about how they conducted the survey. Maybe that's in the downloaded PDF that I didn't look at. I'm just looking at the interactive overview.
Yeah, I didn't see that either. And I noticed something that was odd, which was how underrepresented China was in the data. They had 1% of respondents were in China. And, I did a little bit of looking around, there was a study by NodeSource a year or so ago that indicated that China was at least the largest in the developing world in terms of downloads of Node per month, or downloads of Node overall. Also looking at, other JavaScript communities that I'm a part of, I'm pretty active or getting more and more active in the Vue community. There's tons of Chinese representation there. There's a ton of stuff going on. It makes me think that their survey is probably not, that representative of the actual distribution of Node users, at least when it comes to China.
These things are hard, and they're very hard to do well. And so, as with many of these surveys, like Nick said, this is people who are, it's going to be Node heavy because their point is to profile Node.js users. And so that's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you will. But all these numbers, they're great to think about. They're great for discussions like these. And some of them have to be taken with a grain of salt, knowing that, there are flaws in methodology and in sample sizes and all these things.
I also found interesting that they had separate questions, apparently, distinguishing between Node versus JavaScript. It kind of cracked me up that only 93% of the people who responded to the survey who said they use Node, it said 100% use Node, only 93% said they're using JavaScript.
Do you think that could be taken as like a distinction between front end and back end JavaScript?
Could be. I don't know. Maybe if we're being super generous, though. Once again, looking at a smaller percentage said they were doing front end development of some sort. So, maybe it's a distinction. Maybe folks are using it, but they're only doing development in TypeScript or some sort of compiled to JavaScript language.
I find Node difficult to explain outside of the in crowd because of that reason. Like it's a runtime.
Yeah,
but
it's a runtime.
Exactly. Is that the way you describe to somebody who's maybe either a programmer in a completely different space, or maybe they're just like, what do you do? And then you say, I do Node.js, or...
Yeah, I think you could say it's a runtime. That doesn't mean something. Basically say, it's a system for running JavaScript in places that aren't a web browser.
That's pretty good to say. Now you're good at this, Kevin. See, I'm JBall.
JBall. All right.
What would Kevin say?
I'm going to get you a shirt that says JBall.
Yeah, there you go. So what do you think specifically? This was put on by a third party. So the Node.js Foundation hired out, a third party to conduct the research. Why do you think in their very own survey they would distinguish between Node as a quote unquote language versus JavaScript as a language? I know, Nick, you just kind of guessed at one reason, but isn't that weird?
I think it is, especially since no other language in there, there's no mention of any other framework, I guess. I'd kind of classify Node as a framework, and you don't really see that anywhere else, but then you have the two distinctions between Node and JavaScript. So it is a little weird.
I have two hypotheses. Hypothesis number one, if I look at the PDF, it's branded Node.js, blah, 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 the Linux Foundation. So that hypothesis is the survey was actually administered by a set of folks who help at the Linux Foundation who are not themselves Node users. Hypothesis number two is they're trying to create brand distinction separate from JavaScript.
Yeah.
Both are kind of marketing-ish, I guess, reasons, but
Yeah, I could see both those being, partially true, or maybe both of them are dead on. Since it is a third party conducting the deal, they do their best to completely understand, but maybe they don't. And then secondly, Node.js is a thing, right? It's the Node.js Foundation, nodejs.org. And so, but JavaScript is a bigger thing that encapsulates that thing. And so if you're trying to stand apart in your survey, then you're going to try to distinguish.
yeah, I don't know. It definitely, as someone who uses JavaScript both in a node setting and a non-node setting, it definitely threw me for a loop. I was like, do these guys actually use the thing that they're talking about here?
That they're asking about. Yeah.
What is going on there?
Well, the researchers themselves might not be using Node, and maybe if they're doing data munging, maybe they're using a Python or an R or something else. But lots of people are using Node, and the people that they surveyed sure are. Back to the rapid growth discussion, you have 75% of surveyees planning to increase their usage over the next 12 months. So not only people are using it, but they must be happy with it because they're also going to, use it even more in the next 12 months.
I was really kind of surprised at the numbers for that increase at the expense of other languages like Java and Ruby and PHP. I thought that those were pretty significant decreases. Java is in the next 12 months a 43% decrease, Ruby 37%, and PHP 51%.
Yeah, the one thing I noticed with that, which is, hard to say, but what they're measuring is intent, what people say.
Yeah.
And I dug into that when I was writing that article about this for InfoQ. If you look at the previous year's survey, there were similar reports around how much they're intending to change, right? Python's going to go way up, PHP, Go, Rust, are all these big intents to change. Almost none of those actually translated into changes in this year's survey in percent saying they used it. The only ones that actually changed, well, Python was up slightly, PHP was down slightly. Both Go and Rust, which reported massive intent to increase, were stable in terms of their percent, no change. And Scala and Swift, both of which had a net report of increased intent, were down year over year. So that intent to change, it might be better for us to read that as aspirational. These are the cool hip languages that I really want to be using. These are the old dead languages that I want to get away from. Oh shoot, right. I actually have to keep delivering production code. Well, I'll go with what I know.
Yeah, I think that's, or it's similar to like an exit poll. It's like, who are you going to vote for? And then versus who you actually vote for, come polling day, come the actual voting day. We find those quite different. I'm still just flabbergasted because I'm looking at the languages used, and just other languages used in addition to Node. The top language, JavaScript. It's like, excuse me? Weird, but I have to get over it.
Yeah.
There it is.
Yeah,
I think it still does show just overall satisfaction with JavaScript and the Node ecosystem as compared to other ecosystems for Node developers. Like, Node developers do seem to enjoy the Node ecosystem.
JavaScript, JavaScript.
That's right. And maybe you do see that a little bit with the aspirational intent to diversify, but then the actual not a diversification. There's a lot of things that play into that, like you said, Kevin, maybe the need to ship production code or just use the tools that you're familiar with. But specifically with the desire to get into Go, get into Rust, these are things that would compete specifically with Node on the back end, right? Back-end developers. But the lack of actual movement may indicate that they're either completely satisfied or other reasons that they don't actually go about switching.
One thing I found interesting looking at those languages also was looking at Ruby and Python, and this is going a little bit astray potentially, but kind of in my head, those are in very similar buckets, with the exception that Python is also data science. Like, I think of Ruby and Python as those are the best kind of general purpose starting web development languages, largely because Django and Rails have been so successful. Looking at the survey, like, Python strictly dominates Ruby. It's used by far more people. It's intended to increase by far more people. So I don't know how much of that is specific to folks who are doing Node and which things they're going to replace. How much of that is my perspective is totally biased from living in a startup ecosystem and West Coast to California or California and all of those things, or where that's coming from. I'm curious what your perspectives are on Python versus Ruby.
Well, I would be surprised, but I've seen the data previously, so it doesn't surprise me this time around. I think definitely Ruby gets the larger end of the marketing hype, or at least historically has, and now is getting the short end of the stick on the hype. And so you see a lot of people moving away, whereas Python has remained relatively steady. I think a lot of that number does have to do with just the multifaceted use of Python beyond just the web. And like you said, that it's used in data science. Specifically, now it's becoming even more to the forefront with the shift into a lot of deep learning stuff. So that's probably what I would attribute it to. But it has its hooks deep into academia as well, and these are places that are underrepresented in kind of the typical developer marketing, hacker news, changelog news world, right?
Hey everyone, I'm Tim Smith, senior producer here at Changelog. You know how important it is to stay in the know, and our weekly newsletter helps you and thousands of other developers do exactly that. It's the developer news that matters, nothing more and nothing less. Visit changelog.com and subscribe today.
All right. So another interesting spot in the survey was looking at package use. And this is something where, NPM as a registry kind of typically dominates. You can see these like registry strat stuff where they're adding 500 plus packages a day and really going all over. But there was some interesting data in there about, using Yarn versus NPM or things like that. I think, Nick, did you add the notes on this? Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I can. So I was kind of surprised at how small of a market share Yarn has compared to how much hype it seems to have, with really only being at 13%. That was pretty interesting to me, but it has been increasing over the years.
Well, that's the thing is they noted, if you look at the interactive version of the survey, that 13% is up year over year. I couldn't find any stats in the 2017 data, and didn't Yarn come out in 2017? I mean, it couldn't have been too much usage. When was Yarn actually released? It couldn't have been too long ago.
I want to say 2016.
I found the release blog post, October 11th, 2016.
Okay. And I found the 1.0 release was September 2017, so that's when it was 1.0. So yeah, I guess you could have 2 years of adoption then. But I just couldn't see what that was. I still think 13% is low. But that being said, it seems like NPM, the client, has really reacted to Yarn in many ways and has, they've been working hard. So it's one of those competition, begets quality.
Yeah, I mean, I think the vast, or to me at least, the massively largest value prop that Yarn had was the lock file and getting that reasonably right. Because NPM shrink wrap was a disaster, and NPM kind of took that, and now they have the package lock JSON, and it works pretty much the same. And that the incremental value of Yarn relative to NPM just dropped dramatically. And it may still be better, but it's not like 10x better anymore. It's maybe like 20% better.
So Corbin posted in the chat here. He says this was the news last week. It looks like mixmax.com posted a blog to Yarn and back to NPM again. So we've reached that level of the cycle where, first everybody was switching, and now certain people, at least this particular blog, is switching back. And maybe Corbin, if you can tell us the high level summary of why they're switching back. Maybe it was what we just said here, that it's perhaps incrementally better, but not 10x anymore. It might be the case. My particular use is I've used them both. NPM seems just fine. We have Yarn in changelog's, pipeline and stuff, but I just don't see much of a difference as an end user. I don't dig into them too deeply. I don't write my own packages and stuff. So to me, it's like 6 in one hand and half a dozen in the other.
Yeah, that's the same with me.
I wonder how much of the hype is just Facebook.
Yeah, this is a conversation that comes up often when you have huge tech giants in the open source world. Everything they do makes a splash, and everything they release has more weight behind it than the smaller developers' releases. And so some of that you just see the sheer magnitude of their influence based on who they are. And so maybe some of that was with Yarn. There was a lot of frustration specifically around, install times and stuff with NPM when Yarn first was announced. And so it was way faster at first. And so that was solving a core problem.
It is interesting to look at the way big corporations do open source. Facebook seems to primarily focus on supporting their own open source projects, and they've released a ton to the community, which is phenomenal. But if you contrast to, for example, Google or Apple, both of those companies, they do release their own, and sometimes push their own open source projects, but they also put a ton of time and energy and staffing supporting other ecosystem projects.
So some real-time follow-up on that Mixmax article on why they switched back to NPM or are switching back. And this is a summary coming in from the chat room. The speed was getting way better in NPM and the lock files, like you mentioned, KBall. They didn't like some of the long-standing bugs and breaking bugs in Yarn. And then they said that Yarn has shipped very bad regressions, which made us afraid of upgrading. So that's one company's situation. But I think we're definitely seeing where Yarn has had a huge net impact, like positive influence on the Node and NPM communities. And it's made NPM better, I think, to the point that, pick which one you like more, and you're going to be in pretty good shape.
Yeah, I've seen that type of phenomenon play out in open source projects a few different times, and it's great when it works, right? Because it's great for users to have one de facto place to go, so they don't have to worry about the decision or figuring things out. But if you only have the one and there's never any challengers, then they don't have any incentive to innovate. And so, we saw it in the Ruby community, you saw it with Merb and Rails, and then they eventually merged with Rails taking on all the best things of Merb. We saw it with IO.js, back in the earlier days of Node, and that really pushed Node to change and open up their processes and do all sorts of other fun stuff. Nick highlights Vim and NeoVim in the chat, which I still haven't gotten myself onto NeoVim yet, even despite our conversation the other week, but I'll get there. And now, with Yarn and NPM, if it turns out that we no longer need Yarn because all the benefits it get pulled in by NPM, great.
Makes me think of Atom and VS Code. Oh, maybe we should save that for later.
Yes.
Talk about competing projects that are now co-owned.
VS Atom.
VS Atom.
Well, if you could combine the sort of speed and crispness of VS Code with the programmability of Atom.
The best of both worlds. Or you could combine the worst of both worlds and end up somewhere completely different. So we'll have to see what happens.
Or they might stay separate. Who knows?
So another interesting thing with the package managers, just thinking about NPM as the quote-unquote source of truth for the package management in the system. One thing that I found interesting was more people are using Google to find packages than previous years. And of course, most people are still using npmjs.org, like as their first stop search. But 32% are using Google/other search engine, which is basically just Google, or DuckDuckGo for us hardcores out there. And that's up from the previous year. So I'm wondering if we can correlate that to anything, or if there's some insights about the community that.
How much of that is just Google's search is amazing and everyone else who tries to do search usually sucks? I mean, I use Google to find people on Twitter. I use Google to find people on LinkedIn. I use Google. I mean, all of these are things where like those products have their own searches. They just suck compared to Google.
And I've never actually, like, my workflow has never been go to npmjs.org and search. It's never been that way. It's always been go to Google, search, find it on GitHub, and then click through or find the npm install, whatever the package name is there on GitHub. And then I just never even use npmjs.org in that particular workflow. And I do end up there from time to time, but I've never started there. So it's 38% start their search at npmjs.org and 32% start on Google or some other search engine. Which is up from last year. And then it goes down to like 1% for GitHubs and and Stack Overflows.
I'm the exact same way, and I will Google for it, and if the GitHub package isn't, or the GitHub repository isn't obvious in the Google search results, but the npm page is, I'll click through to npm just so I can click on the GitHub link in there.
Yeah, me too. Actually,
something about the UI in npm, I just don't like it. So I read everything, like the readmes and everything in GitHub.
You're actively avoiding it if you can.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I 100% agree. The npm UI is a pain in the butt, and it doesn't usually. Well, yeah. The nice thing about Google is it'll get you to GitHub, but it'll also often get you to like their documentation page, which if you're trying to decide how to use something, or you're looking for a package that you are already using, documentation is probably what you're looking for.
Yep. And in the same vein, I'll click through to GitHub, and then if there's a link in the top to a documentation page, then I'll click through that. So I'm just clicking all around.
You're just clicking like crazy. You're a crazy clicker.
Before we leave the package managers section, I also thought that it was cool that they highlighted like Node package managers, like NVM, as places where people install Node from. And NVM was pretty high up on that list, and I was curious how you all do that.
I use NVM.
Brew install Node.
Seriously?
I do both.
Seriously?
Seriously?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seriously.
So
No, I'm just kidding. No, yeah, I'm serious.
I brew install it to have like a system node, and then I have NVM to have individual nodes that I might use for different projects that I'm working on. The problem is I don't like NVM because it is so slow, and it slows my terminal down so much unless I don't load it every time I open a new terminal, in which case it doesn't really give me much value. So I'm kind of just stuck in this slow world right now. But it's interesting, and this is also kind of the reason why I don't like globally installed packages. It's just because I don't ever really know which version of Node I might have at my reach.
So for the uninitiated, what does NVM offer that built in, like a homebrew or some other operating system package manager like dpackage or RPMs don't offer?
Just comparing it to homebrew, it just gives me an easy way to install different versions of Node. So I have the latest version from homebrew installed, so that's 10 point something. And then the project that I'm working on right now for my day job is using the LTS version. So I can just say nvm use --LTS and use that, or I can put an nvmrc in that project, and it'll just automatically switch my terminal over to that version when I cd into that directory.
That makes sense. So I think what we're seeing is a distinction between a casual Node user like myself and like a daily driver, a power user like yourself. Anybody who's going to be like actively day-to-day developing a specific app or a set of apps inside of the Node environment, version management and switching easily is definitely a nice to have, or maybe a must have.
Yeah, if you've got projects of different ages, like one of the beauties and the pain points of the Node ecosystem is how fast it changes. And having the ability to stay on the version of Node that you know is working with this project while moving to the latest and greatest and the hot new thing with your new project is, I couldn't trade it for the world. Anytime you have long-lived projects, you need some sort of version manager.
What about this point about the availability of multiple registries? And maybe I'm going down a rat hole here, so this is back to the survey here on package managers. And they asked about the importance of multiple registries. And it was very unimportant. So like the average is like 1 in 3 people think that having multiple registries would be important. Strangely, it was way less in the EMEA, which I can't remember what that stands for. That's basically Europe. What's the M? Help me out, guys. Blanking. Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So I knew what it generally meant, but I couldn't remember what the stinking M stood for. Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And then it's like super high in Latin America, 55%, like almost an outlier, perhaps, of people who think that having multiple registries is important. And when I started to think about this, I thought it in terms of like, is this meaning we shouldn't all rely solely on NPM as a registry now, not as a client? But then the example in there says React versus React Native or CLI. So maybe I'm just asking for some help interpreting this and wondering if you guys understood it better than I did.
I'm really not sure. I mean, is this is this multiple public registries? Because I mean, one direction to go down is, do you need private registries, right? Do you need the ability to set up, internal registries for your company's packages or things like that?
Which then that would make some more sense that it would be so different based on where you are in the world. Like maybe Latin America needs to have even localized registries, either private or even just geographically. Like maybe they just don't have the connection to NPM's points of presence to get the packages they need, or maybe they have social or legal policy in those countries that require private. But that's why I got thrown by such a loop when it says React versus React Native or CLI, kind of in parentheses, as kind of giving context.
That doesn't make any sense to me.
That was one of Ryan Dahl's regrets, to foreshadow a little bit, potentially.
What was that?
Centralized and privately controlled repositories.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely a single point of failure, right?
Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting.
A privately owned single point of failure.
Thinking about the way that other registries are run. So the one that I'm somewhat familiar with is the Ruby Gems registry, and that is kind of supported via donation in a lot of ways. There's a organization and both Ruby together, and then I think Ruby Gems may have its own organization, but it's essentially supported by people donating to this thing. And that has resulted in very slow rates of change and politics over how's that money being used and yada, 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 yada. Whereas in this case, we're actually seeing pretty rapid rates of change in the registry. Like the stuff they're doing with security is really interesting, and they're doing all these extensive things at the registry level. But there's a company owns it, right? I mean,
right. Yeah, it's like it's kind of like it goes back kind of to a BDFL idea, right? Like and really the desire to decentralize is in the case that the BDFL loses its B, right? Like the benevolence goes away.
Right.
And in the case of NPM, like they've been doing, from my perspective, and just echoing what you said there, KBall, they've been doing a very good job, and they are innovating, and they are continuing to work on the product. And we've seen what some competition could do with Yarn and the NPM client, for instance. But it's always like in the back of your mind, like, what if Microsoft buys NPM? Haha. Like what if something changes dramatically? What if it wasn't Microsoft? What if it was Oracle? Or some company that hasn't been such a good steward of open source. And now, like, why? Then we all ask ourselves, why did we put all of our eggs in that one private company's basket? Because the benevolence is gone.
Yes. Oh, Oracle.
So
that's a good way to kill anything.
And I killed the conversation. No. Worth pointing out that there's different package managers that are managing these things differently, and they have their own troubles. With federation, that's hard. With donation models, that's hard. This is not an easy thing to solve. And maybe like in Go's situation, they're like, we just don't have one. So, figure it out amongst yourselves. Or mostly they're using, GitHub URLs, which also becomes a single point of failure. In fact, interestingly, there's been debate now inside of the Go community how to handle that. And they're starting to introduce this idea of vanity imports, just like a vanity domain that you would use to redirect.
Huh.
And so instead of having like the full GitHub URL in your import statement, you have like, jaredsgopackage.com or whatever it is. And inside there, you point that to the source URL. And then I guess the go get command can go ahead and parse that out and follow the redirect. And so in the case that you want to move without having everybody, go change their hard-coded import in their code, you just change the redirect on a domain that you own away from, host A to host B, and you're golden. So they're starting to think about those kind of things, because of recent events.
Is there any community or system that has done this sort of really effectively? I'm thinking about, you look at Linux, there it's actually lots of different companies run their own registries, right? You have, you're going to put your sources, you're going to point at canonical servers if you're on Ubuntu, but you might also point at, a couple extra things and pull stuff down. That's a model for multiple registries in some ways, some private controlled, some public. Glad that's not my job.
I was gonna say there's if you're into this kind of conversation specifically with people who are like knee deep in it, I'll give a quick shout out to our friends at the manifest.fm, which is it's a podcast hosted by Andrew Nesbitt and Alex Pounds. It's all about package management, and they talk to people who are in this space, trying to figure these things out, people from these different ecosystems, and learn the ins and the outs. And Andrew is creator of Libraries.io, which is all about packages as well. So I know that show's a little bit on hiatus. They've had a hard time scheduling it, but there's a bunch of good episodes in the back catalog. So go give that a listen if this is something that interests you. And our particular knowledge here, the three of us, is not doing you justice. You want to hear some people who have answers to these questions. We're good at asking questions around here. We don't always have the answers.
Hey everyone, I'm Tim Smith, senior producer at Changelog. We're so excited to have added the React podcast to our stellar lineup of shows. Every week, Michael Jackson has conversations with developers doing great things in the world of React. You'll hear from people like Andrew Clark, a developer on the React core team at Facebook.
I'm here on the podcast to talk about the thing that I spend most of my time thinking and dreaming and fantasizing and worrying about, which is React, because that is what I do all day, every day. Even when I don't want to.
James Long, who was frustrated with budgeting apps, so he decided to build his own called Actual with React and Electron.
The UI design is just super overcomplicated in so many of the apps out there. You look at some of the screenshots of these apps and there's like 50 numbers on the screen. The simplest question that you want to answer is what I just said, right? What is my finances right now? Should I buy this thing that's $200? Like, can I buy this PS4? Like, how much is that going to hurt me?
Or Henry Zhu. Henry quit his job and is working on open source full time.
I think overall, I feel pretty good about it for sure. There's definitely lots of unknowns and things I have to work out, whether it's just like personally or logistically, all that stuff. But I'm definitely excited for what's in store.
Go to changelog.com/React podcast or wherever you listen to our shows. New episodes come out every Tuesday.
Y'all have been talking a lot about this Dino talk, and I haven't seen it, so I'm just gonna sort of let you do the talking, and then prod you based on your notes that you gave me. But you're talking about change. There's this project that's just started that by one of the founders of Node, Ryan. What's his last name? Ryan
Dahl.
Ryan Dahl. Called Dino, and I guess supposed to replace Node or to go alongside. I don't know. You guys talk about it. You've seen the talk. What is this thing Dino?
Yes. So it's not like a drop-in replacement for Node by any means. He doesn't have any desire for like backwards compatibility with Node, because then he said he would have to just build in all of the regrets. So kind of the context for this is Ryan Dahl gave a 30-minute talk at JSConf, or was it JSConf EU? It was just recently.
Yeah.
Called his 10 regrets with Node or something along those lines. Can't remember the exact title. I thought it was his top 10 things he regrets about Node, but then I only could count like 7 or 8 of them. And so maybe he just misnamed it, but regardless.
That's funny. I actually did separately counted out all of the regrets, and I only got to 7 as well, but with 5 sub points for one of them.
Oh yeah, he went deep on a few of them. It's a great talk. It's about 30 minutes. It was incredibly candid and truthful. And most of these things are the things that he regrets having designed, and they're very technical, and they're specific aspects of Node, the technology. And it was interesting. Michael Rogers, of course, one of our panelists, made the point on Twitter that Node blew up so fast and adoption was so fast that a lot of these things Ryan could have fixed had it not gotten adopted so quickly. He could have fixed them either before 1.0 or in a timed fashion, but he just wasn't able to. And so that was kind of the context of that talk. And that's when he revealed that he's been working on this new project. It's written in Go, although he may rewrite it in Rust, called Dino or Deno. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but it is a V8 runtime for TypeScript, which of course makes it also one for JavaScript. And it's built to be secure and nice and modern and all these other things. And really what it is, I think, is a little bit of a retry, a fresh start based on things that he learned, building Node the first time and the regrets that he has, trying to not have those regrets this time around. So that's the project. It's garnered much interest.
Yeah, I saw it blew up on Hacker News and everybody flooded it with comments and issues, and he had to shut it down and be like, "Hey guys, like this is early."
Yeah, exactly. He saw too much noise and he closed it down or something. Because he's only been working on it for a month, and he calls it alpha software. In fact, he did say he might rewrite the entire thing in Rust or something like that. And so it's very much not ready for production use, but it gets people excited, and that's kind of the situation. Do we want to do a quick rundown of some of his regrets, or?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So the first one is that he didn't embrace promises early on. In fact, it was more like he removed promises. Like he started with promises. He didn't start with promises, but they were introduced early. And Nick, I feel like you have more history than I do, so feel free to hop in or fix or whatever. But he introduced promises and then he took them out. Does that sound right, Nick?
Yeah, so they were in for a bit, and then they were out in favor of the callback syntax for the built-in libraries in Node. So
right.
That kind of that default provide a callback, and the first argument to it will be an error, and if that's null, then there was no error, and then you can continue on from there. I wonder if that would have been an issue if JavaScript hadn't advanced so much in later, more recently. Like if async await had not been a thing that came to the language, would he have a regret about promises?
Yeah,
is something I was wondering.
I mean, even just shifting before, I haven't done too much with async await yet, but even just shifting from callbacks to promises in my own code, it makes it so much easier to think about asynchronicity, and particularly about sort of composing asynchronicity across different modules and functions. Like one of the cool things about Node is how free-flowing and composable it is with all these modules. If it were completely promise-based, that would have been amazing.
Yeah, definitely.
And his supposition, I believe, was if promises had stayed in, then we would have gotten to the async await future much faster than we have, and specifically in the standard library and in the core. And so he regrets having done that. The next one is package.json. And of course, we're missing a lot of the context. So if this is interesting, you definitely go watch it because he'll explain himself much better than I will. But the gist there is that it's too noisy. There's a bunch of stuff that doesn't matter. It makes the system interpret a series of files where you don't really care about that. And he regrets package.json pretty much wholesale.
Yeah, there was really a lot around this. This is the one that I had counted a lot of sub bullet points in there, but it just the whole bit of complexity that it adds to the Node ecosystem, especially as we're trying to push forward with a built-in module system. For example, there's a lot of baggage that Node brings to this, and a lot of complexity with the algorithms for figuring out what code to actually import, and just the overall complexity of having to have this registry, this JSON file describe your project.
The next one was the build system. Like I said, it does get very internal and very technical. And so he says the entire build system's a mess. It's because they use this project called JIP, which was used, I believe, by, was it Chromium or some larger project that he respected at the time. And then they switched away to a newer thing called GN, I think, GN. This is higher than my pay grade right here. But Node got stuck with JIP. And apparently JIP is bad, or the build system is a Rube Goldberg machine type of a thing, according to to Ryan.
It's a Google project, it looks like, originally.
Yeah, and I think Node is the only surviving user, large user of this particular project. And it's hard. It's very, very hard to change, if not impossible to change at this point. There's that one more user-facing one. It's the security, and of course, this is the stuff he's really trying to fix with this new project, as the new project requires explicit and specific passing of data between V8 and the runtime, whereas with Node, especially with binding to system calls and stuff, it's just anything goes. Node modules, and you have anything to add on security, Nick?
No, I was just going to say that's, yeah, like he really called out, like there's no need for something like ESLint to need to have the ability to write to your file system unless it's doing like a fix. But it'd be way more trusting if you knew that modules couldn't actually affect your computer in any way, but right now they can.
So that's really interesting, actually. So would you have to explicitly enable modules to do writing if they were going to, or how would that?
Yeah. So
Yes.
he actually answers this in with Deno, and so Deno is locked down and sandboxed by default. And if you want to allow the code to be able to write to the file system or to make network requests, you have to pass flags to it when you run it. So you would say like Deno -- net to give it network access and -- write to give it write access.
But could you do that on a module by module basis?
That's a good question.
Right, because like I may know that I want to access the net, and I may know that I want to write files, but I might only want to do that through a couple different modules that I trust.
Good question. These are probably concerns he's still hashing out with Deno specifically. So he thinks node modules was a big mistake. Specifically, all of the relative installing into your local folders. He thinks it should work more like browser. Speaking of Go, he referenced Go as a good example. The way that they're doing it, where it's more webby. You just give it a URL or a relative path that's like directly, like if you're linking in your own specific modules. And that's the way that I think Deno is going to work, where it's either an absolute path to a URL somewhere or a relative path that's specifically like inside your local directory. And those are the only two options.
And that's something that would also be heavily cached too. So it relies heavily on Semver to ensure that you're only ever getting the one version. And if you need to change that, you either change the number or you have to pass a flag to tell it to re-download the cached file.
The end of 0.5 gig directories every time I install a new Node project.
Next up, require module, the specific syntax where you can leave off the extension. Like it doesn't have to be require _.js. You just say require _. And he has some of this. You'd have to go watch the talk. Some of it is kind of like him sharing a little bit of wisdom at an older age. It's kind of like when I was young, I thought that this was a good idea because it was, you don't need the extension. But he's like, just write the extension in there. It's just a .js, or then you can even say .ts. Like apparently, the require system has all sorts of logic, traversing the file system, looking at file names, blah blah blah, trying to basically infer what you mean when you don't explicitly state the extension. And so like all that code could disappear if we all just typed .js at the end of those requires. When he would do that, he would do that differently.
That's such a, like, if you look at the course of developers learning, there's this whole thing of like, you start off and you're doing everything explicitly because you don't know how to do anything else. And then you're like, oh, meta programming and inferring things. This stuff is magic. I'm going to do everything meta. And then you get to a point where you're like, yeah, explicit is good. I like explicit.
Yeah. See, I'm at a point where I want just enough magic, and just enough is completely defined by me and changes on a day-to-day basis. That's just enough, but not too much. So yeah, I guess leaving the JS off for him was just a little bit too much magic. And then the other thing, which seems minor but required a complicated implementation, was running the index.js pattern, which he calls too cute. And he thought he was just being cute because you have index.html, and so if you have index.js, we could just pick that up and execute it automatically. And apparently that also requires a whole bunch of heavy lifting underneath the hood that could just be completely removed if you were just explicit about which file you want to execute.
That pattern was probably one of the longest things, or the like, it seems so simple, but it took me a really long time to pick up on that when I started doing Node, because it's nonsensical.
This is kind of adding another layer to it, but I chuckle when I see this in the TypeScript documentation and how they handle module resolution, because on top of the Node resolution that they have for finding an index inside of a directory or inside of Node modules or inside of your global Node modules or all the way up the chain, they also have to look for .ts files, .tsx files, .d.ts files. And so when you import just a a module in TypeScript, there's up to 21 different places that the system has to check for that module, which is just insane.
Wow.
And we wonder why booting apps is slow.
So there's your high level list. Definitely worth watching. Definitely worth looking into and watching his progress on this new project. I would say do Ryan a favor and watch quietly as he's getting hit up. I mean, I was even just looking at his issues list, and just the other day there was like 6 new issues that day, and they were all just like comments or questions or just random stuff. And I'm thinking he's like, why'd I even announce this thing yet? Wait till you got something. Wait till you got something a little more mature to announce. I guess might be what he'll learn this time around. But now it's out there, and it's definitely it's an interesting occurrence. Obviously, it's not like the kind of thing that is going to like wholesale replace Node in 2018 or even 2019. There's something to be said about learning from the quote-unquote sins of the past and using modern tools and techniques to apply similar ideas in a way that ultimately may be much more forward-looking. So
it's interesting to think about, since it is going to provide a JavaScript runtime, like how straightforward would it be to port a Node application over into that? But given the way that we do, nested require and all that other stuff, might be tricky. I wonder if you end up with like the equivalent of a Webpack or some other thing that is translating. It goes through and parses all your JavaScript in Node land, and then rewrites it and produces it for Dino land.
In the little bit of code that he had, kind of showing an example, he was using unpackaged to have a tiny bit of compatibility with Node, but you'd run into all the same problems with, like, if that module's using the Node requires, then you probably can't use it. So it'd be interesting, but it's cool to see unpackage as a potential solution for that in the future if something like this takes off.
I'm not familiar with unpackage. Can you tell me about it real quick?
Oh, sorry. Unpackage, I think it's by Michael Jackson, and it's just a CDN for Node modules. And so it will take any Node module, you can just go to unpackage.com/ I'm trying to think of one, Axios, and then it will have all of the files in there. So then you can just have a URL to the exact .js file that you want to run from within that package and use that. And it's very useful for using Node modules from a CDN and using that as a CDN for Node modules. And also my experience with it is with Code Sandbox. That's where all of the modules that you import from NPM in Code Sandbox, it's just making calls to unpackage to go get those and then bring those in and run them in its little runtime.
Quickly, before we wrap up, since we're talking about change, you want to do quick reactions to the big news of the week?
Can we do
what
quick
did Apple
reactions?
release?
I don't know. Well,
yeah, exactly.
We're low on time, but I feel like we've hinted it enough that it would be a travesty if we didn't talk about it a little bit. So, what are your gut reactions to Microsoft acquiring GitHub?
I'm excited. I think that it's going to be a good thing. I think that it's going to be something that helps push GitHub forward, and hopefully doesn't create a schism in the community.
My first reaction was shock, and now the shock is worn off. I talked about this. I think Adam and I did about 40 minutes on Spotlight, so we'll link that in the notes here if you want more thoughts. But in brief, I'm coming around to the idea, and I think everything's going to be okay. How about you? How about you, KBall?
I'm kind of in a wait and see place. Microsoft has been a much better supporter and steward of open source over the last few years than they were previously, and they've really kind of opened up both what they're doing but also their support of community efforts, and they have not killed recent acquisitions. I mean, LinkedIn seems to be thriving. I don't remember what some of their other acquisitions have been, but they're not an Minecraft. Oracle, right? They're not gonna shut this thing down and just try to lock out the technology or use patent wars or anything like that. They seem to be acting more and more as a good steward. So I don't see any major reasons for concern because of that. I do suspect that we'll start to see lots of kind of hints towards, oh, well, you're using GitHub. Well, naturally you can put hook things up from GitHub to every time you push deploy it in Azure and do other things that kind of nudge you towards their other products. But so long as they maintain open and they keep an open API so that it's not impossible to have the same thing set up so it deploys it over to AWS or to Google Cloud or wherever you might be deploying, then I don't see a huge problem with that.
Peter Bright wrote a great piece in Ars Technica the other day. I guess it was maybe Monday or Tuesday of this week. Says, and the headline is, everyone complaining about Microsoft buying GitHub needs to offer a better solution. And his subtitle is GitHub needed a buyer and there aren't too many options. And we'll link that one in the show notes as well if you want to read a little more about that, because the fact of the matter is, and this was a surprise to a certain degree, especially with how much revenue GitHub was doing, like $200 million a year. Sounds pretty good. It'd keep this boat floating over here. But much smaller boat, I guess.
Yeah, I'll take that.
But exactly. But they needed a buyer. And if you go and he actually runs down the list of potential acquirers or potential solutions for GitHub, including IPO and including going and getting more VC. And he makes a pretty compelling case that this is actually the best option in a sea of other options. So that was a good read, and I'll just submit that to everybody. If you're still, I mean, definitely wait and see, right? Definitely remain skeptical or whatever, wherever you're at, that's fine. But I think that had this not happened, we probably would have ended up with potentially a much worse scenario. So
yeah, and I think that you and Adam cover it really well in that Spotlight episode. But Git is very portable, so if something happens in the future, it's pretty darn easy to move somewhere else.
Unless you have all these GitHub URLs hard coded into your code.
Well, and recall, npm package JSON, there are shortcuts that go to GitHub URLs. In Nodeland, there are, I don't know how many people are using that for, they're probably not using it for modules that are being published, but there are plenty of projects that are, end projects not intended to be reused or included that are referencing GitHub URLs.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to my overlaying sentiment. Overlaying. Something I say all the time, which is like the web is like the world, It's property. And you don't want to rent. You want to own. So own your own space and then link out from there and own something you control, your own domain, your own Git repos, whatever it happens to be, to the best that you can, own that and link to these other places, because ultimately, these service providers can and will change. And if you don't own what you're doing, then they own it.
And somebody like Oracle can buy it. So that is it for today's JS Party. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Node.js user study, the future of Node, Dino, what have you, and a little bit about this week's big news. Tune in live at Thursday. I'll do noon because y'all actually call it noon Central, 10 p.m. Pacific time. Join us and we'll see you next time.
All right, thank you for tuning in to JS Party this week. Tune in live on Thursdays at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern at changelog.com/live. Join the community and Slack with us in real time during the shows. Head to changelog.com/community. And do us a favor, share this show with a friend, rate us on Apple Podcast, go into Overcast and favorite it. And thank you to Fastly, our bandwidth partner. Head to fastly.com to learn more. And we move fast to fix things around here at Changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com. We're hosted on Linode Cloud servers. Head to linode.com/changelog. Check them out and support this show. Our music is produced by Breakmaster Cylinder. And you can find more shows just like this at changelog.com. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.
Who's actually in Central Time? Let's call it 10 and 1.
I am. Nick is.
I am.
Adam is, and Tim is.
I don't know who y'all represent. The coasts, the tech community lives on the coasts, right? No.
Hey, they call it the Central Time Zone for a reason, because we're the center of everything.
Center of everything. All right.
We don't coast around here.